By early 1964, the conflict in Vietnam was little more than a faint echo in the lives of most Americans. The war, with its distant jungles and unseen battles, seemed like someone else's problem half a world away. But beneath the surface, the roots of a storm were already taking hold. Vietnam was a nation split in two, North against South, communism against democracy. With global superpowers backing each side, this small nation became the stage for a much larger ideological war. But as the battle lines were drawn, an urgent question hovered over Washington. How long could the United States stand on the sidelines? Throughout 1964, the conflict deepened. Guerrilla ambushes, political assassinations, and growing instability in South Vietnam left American leaders with fewer options. President Lyndon Johnson spoke of freedom and responsibility, but his words couldn't silence the growing fears of mothers, fathers, and young soldiers who began to sense the storm ahead. Then came the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964. A clash in murky waters triggered one of the most consequential decisions in American history. Congress handed President Johnson sweeping authority to respond, setting the stage for full-scale military engagement. With one act, the United States took its first irrevocable step into the heart of Vietnam. The years that followed would be marked by conflict, sacrifice, and the unraveling of simple solutions. The Battle of Ia Drang, fought in late 1965, would test the United States' resolve and usher in a new era of warfare. But it was only the beginning, an early chapter in a war that would reshape history. This is the story of Vietnam, a war fought not only in the jungles and the skies, but also in the hearts and minds of those who lived it. In the summer of 1964, a single event off the coast of North Vietnam would mark a turning point in the conflict. Two incidents involving the USS Maddox, patrolling in the Gulf of Tonkin, sparked a dramatic escalation in U.S. involvement. The first skirmish on August 2nd saw North Vietnamese torpedo boats engage the Maddox. The ship repelled the attack, suffering minimal damage, but tensions surged. Just 2 days later, reports of a second attack reached Washington, though later evidence would cast doubt on whether this attack ever truly occurred. The timing, however, was critical. President Lyndon Johnson wasted no opportunity to act decisively. Declaring that American forces had been the victim of deliberate aggression, he called on Congress for authority to respond. The result was the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Passed almost unanimously, it granted Johnson sweeping powers to escalate U.S. military involvement in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. With this single resolution, the United States crossed a critical threshold. What had once been a limited advisory role now evolved into a commitment to protect South Vietnam at any cost. But as the ink dried on the resolution, questions lingered. Could this show of strength prevent further escalation, or had the United States just taken its first irreversible step into a protracted war? As the ink on the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution dried, the situation in Vietnam rapidly spiraled. The Viet Cong, emboldened by North Vietnamese support, began launching direct attacks on U.S. installations in South Vietnam. In November 1964, a Viet Cong raid on the Bien Hoa Air Base killed 4 Americans and destroyed several aircraft. By early 1965, another devastating strike at Pleiku left 8 U.S. servicemen dead and over 100 wounded. These bold, calculated assaults signaled that the conflict was no longer limited to the South Vietnamese Army. America itself was now squarely in the crosshairs. For President Lyndon Johnson, the stakes had never been higher. The attacks demanded a response, yet the fear of overcommitting weighed heavily. Johnson's speeches emphasized America's duty to safeguard freedom and defend allies, but privately, he agonized over the consequences. Each night he reportedly asked himself, "Have I done enough to unite the world and bring peace?" The response came in February 1965 with the launch of Operation Rolling Thunder, a large-scale bombing campaign targeting North Vietnam. Its goals were clear: cripple the North's war machine and demonstrate the overwhelming power of the United States. Yet optimism quickly gave way to frustration. Pilots returned to the same targets repeatedly, only to see the enemy rebuild with unyielding resolve. What was planned as an 8-week mission stretched on, with little sign of breaking Hanoi's will. As American bombs fell from the skies, Johnson faced mounting pressure to protect the air bases and personnel under attack. For the first time, U.S. commanders requested ground troops, not just for advisory roles, but to take the fight directly to the Viet Cong. The question now was no longer if American soldiers would enter the war, but how many and how soon. By March 1965, the war in Vietnam had reached a tipping point. Following months of escalating attacks on U.S. installations, President Lyndon Johnson authorized the deployment of combat-ready ground troops. On March 8th, 3,500 Marines of the 9th Expeditionary Brigade landed at Da Nang, marking the first official deployment of American combat forces to South Vietnam. These Marines arrived under the guise of a defensive mission, tasked with protecting U.S. air bases from Viet Cong attacks. But for many, the symbolism of their landing was clear. The United States was no longer simply advising South Vietnam. It was taking charge. As one young soldier put it, "We've heard of Vietnam, but now we're here, and this time it's for real." The situation escalated further in July, when Johnson announced a dramatic increase in troop levels. Ground forces would expand from 75,000 to 125,000 almost immediately, with the draft ramping up to meet the demand. The shift from advisory support to direct combat raised difficult questions. Could an influx of troops stabilize South Vietnam, or would this surge merely deepen America's entanglement in a conflict with no clear end in sight? As the troop numbers swelled, so too did the scope of their mission. U.S. forces transitioned from defensive positions to offensive operations. Helicopters and air mobility, a revolutionary concept in modern warfare, became central to American strategy. Soldiers were no longer confined to roads or static bases. Instead, they were delivered directly into remote battle zones, disrupting enemy strongholds and supply lines. It was a bold approach, but one fraught with risks. As the soldiers prepared for these new missions, the stage was being set for one of the first major tests of this strategy, a confrontation that would come to define the early years of America's war in Vietnam. By the fall of 1965, Vietnam was no longer a distant advisory mission. With over 150,000 U.S. troops now deployed, the war had entered a new and dangerous phase. American soldiers were scattered across South Vietnam, engaging in skirmishes and patrols, yet finding it increasingly difficult to locate an enemy that seemed to vanish into the dense jungle after every attack. The North Vietnamese Army, known as the NVA, and Viet Cong were masters of guerrilla warfare, blending into the civilian population by day and launching deadly strikes by night. Intelligence reports suggested that enemy forces were pouring into the south at an alarming rate, using the Ho Chi Minh Trail as a lifeline to supply weapons, troops, and reinforcements. U.S. commanders needed a new approach, one that could deliver a decisive blow. This opportunity came in November 1965, when intelligence revealed that a significant NVA force was massing near Chu Pong Mountain, close to the Cambodian border. Colonel Hal Moore of the 1st Cavalry Division was tasked with leading an assault to cut off and destroy these enemy forces. His unit was equipped with a revolutionary new tactic: air mobility. Using helicopters, Moore's troops could be rapidly inserted deep into enemy-held territory, bypassing traditional ground routes and striking directly at the heart of the NVA's operations. But the plan came with risks. The chosen landing zone, designated LZX-Ray, was small and dangerously close to enemy positions. Helicopters could only land a few soldiers at a time, leaving the first waves of troops vulnerable to being overwhelmed. As the operation approached, the stakes couldn't have been higher. For the first time, American forces would go head-to-head with a large, organized North Vietnamese force. Soldiers prepared themselves for what was to come, unaware that the battle they were about to fight would set the tone for the years of conflict ahead. On the morning of November 14, 1965, the soldiers of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, under the command of Colonel Hal Moore, boarded helicopters bound for a clearing near Chu Pong Mountain. Designated Landing Zone X-Ray, this small patch of ground would soon become the epicenter of one of the Vietnam War's fiercest battles. The mission was simple on paper: insert troops, locate the enemy, and destroy their forces. But in reality, it was far more dangerous. The helicopters could only carry a limited number of soldiers at a time, forcing the troops to land in waves. By the time the first group of 80 men hit the ground, they were surrounded by an estimated 1,600 North Vietnamese soldiers. The men of the 7th Cavalry were outnumbered more than 8-1, and it was clear that they would have to fight for survival until reinforcements could arrive. As the battle began, the NVA unleashed wave after wave of relentless assaults attempting to overwhelm the small American force. The noise was deafening: rifle fire, mortar shells, and the cries of men filled the air. Soldiers scrambled to hold their positions, calling in artillery strikes and air support to keep the enemy at bay. It was here, in the chaos, that Colonel Moore's leadership shone through. He moved among his men, directing the defense and ensuring the lines held against the onslaught. By midday, the situation was dire. Casualties were mounting and the enemy seemed to be everywhere. At one critical moment, Moore issued the radio call for Broken Arrow, a code that signaled an American unit was in danger of being overrun. The response was immediate. Every available aircraft in Vietnam was redirected to provide close air support. Jets and bombers screamed overhead, dropping napalm and high-explosive bombs that tore through the jungle and sent the NVA into retreat. But the price of survival was steep. Friendly fire incidents caused by the chaotic bombing runs added to the growing toll of dead and wounded. Soldiers carried their injured comrades to makeshift aid stations, while others held the line through sheer determination and grit. The fighting continued into the night, with both sides suffering heavy losses. For 2 more days, the battle raged. Reinforcements arrived, but so did more North Vietnamese troops, turning the area around LZX-Ray into a cauldron of destruction. By the time the fighting finally ended, 234 American soldiers had been killed and many more wounded. Estimates of North Vietnamese casualties exceeded 1,000. The Battle of Ia Drang was America's first major engagement with North Vietnamese forces, and it set the tone for the rest of the war. It demonstrated the power of air mobility and the resilience of U.S. soldiers, but it also revealed the brutal cost of the conflict. This was no quick war, no decisive victory. It was a long, grinding struggle, fought in blood and fire that would leave scars on all who endured it. The Battle of Ia Drang ended with American forces holding the ground, their resilience and firepower delivering a lopsided kill ratio of 12-1. For U.S. commanders, this result seemed to validate their strategy. The helicopter, once an experimental tool, had proven itself indispensable in modern warfare. Yet, as the dust settled, a sobering truth began to emerge. Victory was not measured in the ground held, but in the enemy killed, and even that measure came at a staggering cost. In the months that followed, a new strategy took shape: search and destroy. Its purpose was brutally simple: seek out the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army wherever they hid and eliminate them in numbers so overwhelming that they could no longer continue the fight. It was a strategy that would define the next phase of the war, but it came with challenges that few could have anticipated. The Viet Cong were masters of their environment, blending into the jungles and villages, indistinguishable from the 17 million civilians of South Vietnam. They dug miles of tunnels, planted tens of thousands of booby traps, and struck from the shadows with devastating precision. For American soldiers, the battlefield was not just the jungle. It was every step they took, every hut they entered, and every field they crossed. As troop levels surged throughout 1966, the war became personal for countless young Americans. The realities they faced would test not only their training but their very humanity. This new phase of the war, marked by relentless search and destroy missions, set the tone for the grueling years ahead. The jungles of Vietnam became both a battlefield and a crucible, shaping the men who fought there while revealing the limitations of conventional military power in an unconventional war. It was here, in this next chapter, that the Vietnam War would grow darker, more complex, and far more costly.